In the wild lands east of the Shire, where the wind whispers through ancient barrows and forgotten ruins, there walked a ranger unlike any other of the Dunedain. Aldenor, son of Baranor, bore the mark of his lineage in his grey eyes and weathered hands, yet within his heart dwelt a darkness that no sword could cleave, nor bow could pierce, the terror that came with nightfall. The other rangers spoke his name with respect, for his skill with blade and bow was unmatched when the sun held dominion over Middle-earth. But when twilight painted the sky in shades of amber and crimson, Aldenor would seek the nearest village, the closest inn, any place where flame and fellowship might hold the creeping shadows at bay. This was his shame, known to few, but felt by all who rode beside him. It was in the shadow of Weathertop that his tale truly began. On a day when autumn's breath carried the scent of dying leaves and distant rain, Aldenor had been tracking a band of goblins that had descended from the misty mountain, their crude spears thirsting for the blood of merchants traveling the east road. The trail was fresh, the signs clear to one trained in the lore of the wild. As the sun began its slow descent toward the western hills, painting the broken crown of Amon Sul in golden light, Aldenor felt the familiar tightness in his chest. The darkness was coming, and with it, the whispers that only he could hear. Voices from a past he had buried beneath years of wandering and duty. His horse, Rachalion, sensed his master's unease and whinnied softly, as if offering comfort to one who had comforted him through many a storm. But this day would be different. As Aldenor prepared to abandon his quarry and seek the safety of Bree's lamplit streets, a cry pierced the gathering dusk. High and clear it rang, the voice of a woman in mortal peril, coming from the very ruins he had sworn never to approach in darkness. Upon the weathered stones of Weathertop, where once Elendil's watchtower had stood proud against the sky, shapes moved in the dying light. The goblins had taken a prisoner, a young woman whose silver cloak marked her as one of high birth. They danced about her with wicked glee, their leader holding aloft a curved blade that caught the last rays of the sun. Aldenor's hand moved to his sword, then fell away. The darkness was spreading like ink across parchment, and with it came the memories he had fought so long to suppress, the screams of his kinsmen, the smell of smoke and blood, the laughter of enemies cloaked in shadow. Yet as he sat frozen upon his horse, torn between duty and terror, the woman's eyes found his across the distance. In them he saw not fear, but an expectation of hope, the trust that one of the Dunedain would not abandon the innocent to the malice of the enemy's servant. The moment stretched like a bowstring drawn taut, fraught with the weight of decision. Below, on the ancient stone, the goblins had begun their cruel sport, prodding their captive with spear points and singing in their harsh tongue songs that spoke of torture and death. The woman, for now, Aldenor could see she was little more than a maiden, perhaps 20 summers, bore their torments with a dignity that spoke of noble blood. Rachalion stamped and snorted, feeling his master's conflict as keenly as if it were his own. The great horse had carried Aldenor through many dangers, but never had he sensed such turmoil in the man who had raised him from a colt. "Peace, old friend," Aldenor whispered, his voice barely audible above the evening wind. "Would that your courage could fill the hollow places in my heart." The sun touched the horizon now, a great orb of fire sinking into the western lands. With each moment of its passing, the shadows grew longer and more menacing. Soon the stars would emerge, and with them the true darkness that had haunted Aldenor's dreams since childhood. Yet still the woman's gaze held his, and in her eyes he saw something that gave him pause. Not merely hope, but recognition. She knew him. The realization struck like a thunderbolt. Through the gathering gloom, he studied her face more closely, noting the proud set of her jaw, the way she held herself despite her bonds. Memories stirred, bringing with it images from a time when he had walked not in the wild places, but in halls of stone, when his name had been spoken with honor rather than whispered with pity. "Miriel," he breathed, the name torn from his lips like a prayer. She was changed, grown from the girl he had known into a woman of surpassing beauty. but the eyes remained the same, gray as winter storm, bright with intelligence and will. Miriel of Fornos, daughter of the chieftain who had once called Aldanor friend and brother in arms, the same Miriel who had been present on that terrible night 20 years past, when darkness had come creeping into the halls of men, and Aldanor had learned what it meant to be afraid. The goblin leader raised his blade high, speaking words in the black speech that made the very air seem to writhe. Other shapes moved in the ruins now. Wolves, Aldanor realized with growing horror, their eyes gleaming like coals in the dying light. A full pack, drawn by the scent of blood and the promise of easy prey. Time slowed to a crawl. Aldanor felt his breathing grow shallow, his hands shake upon the rein. The old fear clawed at his mind, whispering of failure, of death, of the consuming dark that awaited all who dared to stand against it. Yet above the whispers came another voice, clear and strong as a horn call at dawn. "Aldanor!" Miriel cried, her voice carrying across the space between them. "The light has not gone out of the world. Remember who you are, who he was, a ranger of the north, a guardian of the innocent, one who had sworn oaths in the light of day that should not be broken merely because night had come." With a sound that was half sob, half war cry, Aldanor drew his sword and spurred Rochalion toward the ruins of Weathertop. The steel of Aldanor's blade sang as it cleared the scabbard, its edge bright with the last light of day. Rochalion bounded up the weathered slope of Amon Sul with the grace of a deer, his hoofbeats ringing against stone like the drums of war. Behind them, the sun finally vanished beneath the rim of the world, and darkness began its reign. The goblins turned at his approach, their surprise giving way quickly to savage delight. Here was sport more to their liking than the torment of a helpless maiden, a lone warrior riding to his doom in the gathering night. Their leader, a creature of unusual size, scars marking his hide like a map of old battles, bared his fangs in what might have passed for a grin. "Tark!" it snarled in the common tongue. "You come to die with the she-worm? Good! Grishak will feast on man-flesh tonight." The pack of wolves that had been circling the ruins now converged upon this new threat, their howls rising to join the guttural laughter of the goblin. They moved with the coordination of creatures long used to hunting together, seeking to surround and bring down their prey through weight of numbers. But Aldanor had not survived 20 years in the wild by fighting fairly. As Rochalion crested the rise, the ranger threw himself from the saddle in a move that spoke of countless hours of practice. He landed in a roll that brought him to his feet behind the goblin line, his blade already weaving a web of steel about him. The first wolf died with a whine, its throat opened by a stroke that seemed almost casual in its precision. The second leaped at his back, only to meet the point of a long knife that had appeared in Aldanor's left hand, as if by magic. The goblins rushed him then, their crude weapons raised high, but found themselves facing not a terrified man, but a warrior in his element. For when battle was joined, the fear that paralyzed Aldanor in the dark hours held no dominion. His body knew its work, muscles trained by years of conflict moving with deadly efficiency. His sword took the arm from one goblin, opened the belly of another, and turned aside a spear thrust that would have pierced his heart. Yet even as he fought, Aldanor could feel the night pressing in around him. The stars were emerging one by one, cold and distant in the darkening sky. Soon the moon would rise, and with it would come the full weight of his terror. He had perhaps minutes before his courage failed entirely. Grishak, the goblin leader, seemed to sense this weakness. Instead of pressing the attack, he called his remaining warriors back and began to circle the ranger like a predator, stalking wounded prey. "Yes," the creature hissed, its voice thick with malice. "I smell your fear, man-thing. The darkness calls to you, whispers of failure and death. Soon you will kneel before Grishak and beg for the mercy that will not come." Miriel struggled against her bonds, her voice ringing clear despite her peril. "Do not listen to its lies, Aldanor. You are stronger than your fear." But even as she spoke, the ranger felt his hands begin to tremble. The familiar weight of dread settled upon his shoulders like a cloak of lead. Around him, the darkness seemed to take on a life of its own, reaching toward him with tendrils of shadow that existed as much in his mind as in the world beyond. It was then that Grishak struck, his blade moving with surprising speed toward Aldanor's exposed side. Steel rang against steel as Aldanor's sword swept up to catch the goblin's blade, but the force of the blow drove him backward. Grishak was stronger than he had appeared, his scarred hide speaking of battles won as much as survived. The creature pressed its advantage, raining down blows that tested the ranger's guard to its limits. "Feel it, man-flesh," the goblin crooned as their weapons locked. "The cold breath of night upon your neck, the whispers that speak of all you have lost, all you have failed to save." Aldanor's vision began to blur at the edges. The familiar symptoms were taking hold: the racing heart, the shortened breath, the sweat that had nothing to do with exertion. Around him the darkness seemed to pulse with malevolent life, and from within it came voices he had not heard in 20 years. "Father, Father, help us. The fire spreads too quickly. We cannot reach them. All is lost. All is lost." His blade wavered, and Grishak's sword scraped along his ribs, parting leather and drawing blood. The goblin laughed, a sound like stones grinding in a mill wheel. "Yes, remember, Ranger. Remember the night when you cowered like a child while your kinsman burned." The words struck like physical blows. Somehow, this creature knew of that terrible night in Fornost, when orc raiders had fired the outer halls, knew of the children trapped in the nursery, knew of Aldanor's paralysis when darkness had fallen and duty had called him to impossible courage. But it was Miriel's voice that cut through the haze of memory and terror. "Look at me, Aldanor. Look at me now." Her words carried an authority that pierced even the goblin's spell of malice. Despite himself, Aldanor's gaze found hers across the space that separated. In her eyes, he saw not the accusation he had expected, not the condemnation he felt he deserved, but something that took his breath away. "Forgiveness. You saved 7 that night," she said, her voice steady despite the bonds that held her. "7 children who lived because you found the courage to act when others could not. I was one of them, Aldanor. I remember." The memory came flooding back, not the failure he had dwelt upon for 2 decades, but the truth he had been too consumed by shame to acknowledge. The nursery ablaze, the corridors filled with smoke, and yes, his moment of paralysis, when fear had nearly overwhelmed him. But then had come the choice. The same choice he faced now, and he had chosen to act. 7 children carried to safety through halls of flame. 7 lives preserved when others had given them up for lost. Among them, a gray-eyed girl who had looked at him with trust rather than terror, even as the world burned around them. Grishak sensed the change in his opponent and pressed his attack with renewed fury. But something had shifted in the ranger's stance. The trembling in his hands had ceased, replaced by the steady grip of one who had faced darkness before and found the light within it. "Your words have no power here," Aldanor said quietly, his blade catching the goblin's next strike and turning it aside with contemptuous ease. "I know who I am." The creature snarled and redoubled its efforts, but now it faced not a terror-stricken man, but a Dunedain in the fullness of his skill. Aldanor's sword sang through the air, each stroke precise and purposeful, driving the goblin backward across the ancient stones. Yet, even as he fought, a part of his mind wondered at the strangeness of their meeting. How had Grishak known of that night in Fornost? How had Miriel come to be here, so far from the halls of her fathers? And why did the very air around them seem to thrum with power, as if unseen forces moved in the darkness beyond? The answer would come soon enough. But first, there was a battle to be won. The tide of battle turned as swiftly as weather in the mountains. Where moments before Aldanor had been driven back by fear and doubt, now he advanced with the measured pace of one who had found his center. Grishak gave ground, his earlier confidence eroding with each stroke of the ranger's blade. The remaining goblins, seeing their leader pressed, rushed to his aid with wild cries. But they found themselves facing not merely a skilled warrior, but something more, a man who had looked into his own darkness and chosen light. Aldanor's sword seemed to glow with its own radiance, though whether this was trick of starlight or something more, none could say. One goblin fell, then another, their crude weapons no match for steel wielded by a master. The wolves, less bound by loyalty than their goblin allies, began to slink away into the shadows, sensing that the hunt had turned against them. It was then that Miriel spoke words that rang across the ruins like silver bells. Gil-galad was an elven king, of him the harpers sadly sing, the last whose realm was fair and free, between the mountains and the sea. The ancient song seemed to give substance to the light that played about Aldanor's blade. Grishak stumbled backward, raising one clawed hand to shield his eyes from a radiance that existed as much in the realm of spirit as of sight. "Impossible," the creature snarled. "The light fails, the darkness grows. You cannot stand against the tide that comes." But Aldanor pressed forward, and with each step he took, more of the song poured from Miriel's lips. His sword was long, his lance was keen, his shining helm afar was seen. The countless stars of heaven's field were mirrored in his silver shield. Power thrummed in the air around them, ancient and benevolent, the same force that had once stood against the shadow in ages past. Grishak's blade, which had seemed so threatening moments before, now appeared pitiful and small against the growing light. With a final desperate cry, the goblin leader lunged forward in an attack that held all his remaining strength. But Aldanor was ready. His sword swept up in an arc that caught the starlight and seemed to multiply it tenfold, meeting Grishak's blade at the perfect angle to turn it aside and continue upward in one smooth motion. The goblin's head flew from his shoulders in a spray of black blood, his body toppling backward to lie still upon the stones of Amon-Sul. The remaining creatures of darkness fled, shrieking into the night, leaving the ranger and the maiden alone among the ruins. Aldanor stood motionless for a moment, breathing heavily, his sword still gleaming with that strange radiance. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the light faded, and he was merely a man once more, a man who had faced his greatest fear and found himself still standing. He turned to where Miriel sat bound, and with swift strokes of his knife cut through the ropes that held her. She rose gracefully, rubbing circulation back into her wrists, her gray eyes studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You have changed," she said softly, "and yet you have not changed at all. How came you to be here?" Aldanor asked, avoiding her gaze. "Fornost is many leagues distant, and these roads are perilous for any to travel alone." A shadow crossed her features, and for the first time since her rescue, Miriel looked away. "I was not traveling by choice," she said. "I was fleeing." "From what?" "From a marriage my father would force upon me, to a man whose gold weighs more heavily in the chieftain's mind than his character." There was bitterness in her voice, and something else, a fear different from that which had gripped her when facing the goblin's blades. Aldanor felt a familiar anger kindle in his heart, the same righteous fury that had driven him to take up the ranger's path when politics and greed had poisoned the counsels of his people. "And so you thought to find sanctuary in the wild?" he asked gently. "I thought to reach Rivendell," she replied. "There are still those who remember the old alliances, who might offer shelter to one who seeks to choose her own path. But I lost my way in the marshes south of Bree, and when night fell, she did not need to finish. The wild lands held many dangers for the unwary, and a lone woman would be prey to more than goblins and wolves." "Rivendell is far," Aldanor said slowly, "and the paths treacherous. You would need a guide." Their eyes met across the space between them, and in that moment both felt the weight of decision. 20 years had passed since their paths had diverged, 20 years in which he had wandered the margins of the world, while she had grown to womanhood in the halls of her father. Yet something of the bond forged in flame and terror still remained, stronger perhaps for having been tested by time. "Will you come with me?" she asked simply. Before he could answer, a new sound reached their ears, the thunder of hoofbeats approaching from the north. Many horses, riding hard through the night, their path set unerringly for the ruins of Weathertop. The riders came up the slope of Amon-Sul like a dark tide, their horses breathing hard from the pace they had set across the wild lands. 20 men or more, Aldanor judged by the sound, armed and mounted, as befitted a chieftain's household guard. At their head rode a figure that made Míriel draw sharp breath and step closer to the ranger's side. "Brenor," she whispered, and in that name was all the fear that goblin blades had failed to evoke. The man who crowned the rise was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair streaked with premature gray, and his face marked by the kind of cruelty that masquerades as strength. Gold gleamed at his throat and wrists, and his sword was wrought with such craft as spoke of wealth beyond the measure of most men. Behind him rode warriors whose faces bore the hard stamp of those who served for coin rather than honor. "My beloved," Brenor called out, his voice carrying easily across the ruins, "how you have led me a chase! But the game ends now, as games must when night falls and the hunters close their snare." Aldanor stepped forward, placing himself between Míriel and the mounted men. His sword was still in his hand, though he had not consciously drawn it, and starlight ran along its edge like water. "The lady is under my protection," he said, his voice carrying the authority of one long accustomed to command. "I suggest you and your men seek other roads." Brenor laughed, the sound harsh as the caw of raven. "Your protection? And who might you be, wanderer, to speak so boldly to Brenor, son of Baver, who holds the seal of the chieftain and the right of marriage claim?" "I am Aldanor of the Dunedain," the ranger replied, "and I know something of rights and claims. A woman's consent weighs more heavily in the balance than any seal or gold." "Consent?" Brenor's eyes glittered with malice. "What need have I of consent when law and custom stand with me? The contract was signed, the bride price paid. She is mine by right, to do with as I will." Several of his men had begun to spread out, seeking to surround the two figures standing among the ruins. Aldanor noted their movement, with the part of his mind trained to such things, calculating distances and angles, weighing odds that grew worse with each passing moment. "There is another law," he said calmly, "older than custom and stronger than gold. The law that says no person shall be made chattel of another, neither man nor woman, neither high-born nor low." "Pretty words," Brenor sneered, "but words will not serve you here, ranger. You face 20 men, well-armed and mounted. Surrender the woman, and you may ride away with your life. Refuse, and die here among the stones like the goblins whose stench still fouls the air." It was then that Míriel stepped forward, her voice ringing clear in the night air. "I will not go with you, Brenor. Not now, not ever. Find some other woman to purchase with your gold, for I am not for sale." The man's face darkened with rage, and his hand moved to his sword hilt. "Proud words from one who flees like a thief in the night. But your pride will be broken, my dear, as a horse is broken to the bridle. There are ways to teach obedience to those who forget their place." The threat in his words was unmistakable, and Aldanor felt the familiar fire of righteous anger kindle in his breast. This was why he had taken up the ranger's path, to stand between the innocent and those who would prey upon them, to be a sword in the darkness for those who had no other defense. "Then we have nothing more to discuss," he said, and raised his blade to catch the starlight. But even as the words left his lips, he felt the first stirrings of the old fear. The battle with the goblins had been fought in the heat of the moment, when action had swept aside thought and terror alike. Now, facing human enemies in the deep of night, with time to contemplate what was to come, the darkness pressed in around him once more. 20 men, 20 trained warriors with steel in their hands and murder in their hearts. And he but one, standing on ancient stones in the middle of nowhere, with no hope of aid or reinforcement. Brenor sensed the moment of weakness and smiled, an expression that held no warmth. "I see you begin to understand your position, ranger, but I am not without mercy. Kneel now, yield up the woman, and I will make your death a clean one." It was Míriel who saved him, her hand touching his arm with a contact that burned away doubt like flame-consuming parchment. "Remember what I said," she whispered. The light has not gone out of the world, and we do not stand alone here. As if summoned by her words, shapes began to appear at the edges of the ruins, tall figures cloaked in gray, with faces that held the ageless quality of those touched by more than mortal blood. Elves, Aldenor realized with wonder, though what had brought them to this place at this hour was beyond his guessing. The leader of the company stepped forward, throwing back his hood to reveal features of surpassing beauty and eyes that held the light of stars. When he spoke, his voice carried the music of wind in tall trees and the whisper of water over stones. "Well met, Aldenor of the Dunedain," he said. "I am Glorfindel of Rivendell, and I bring word from Elrond, master of that realm. You and your companion are expected." The appearance of the elves changed everything in the space of a heartbeat. Brenor's men, who moments before had been confident in their overwhelming numbers, now shifted uneasily in their saddles. To face a single ranger was one thing, to stand against the firstborn was quite another. Even the most gold-hungry sellsword knew the tales of what befell those who raised weapons against the Eldar. Glorfindel stepped fully into the circle of stone, and other figures followed, tall warriors whose mail gleamed silver in the starlight, their faces bearing that ageless quality that spoke of years beyond the count of mortal men. At their presence, the very air seemed to grow lighter, as if some burden had been lifted from the world. "Lord Glorfindel," Brenor said, and his voice held a careful neutrality that had not been there moments before. "This is unexpected. What brings the servants of Rivendell to meddle in the affairs of mortal men?" The elf lord's gaze shifted to the merchant, and in those ancient eyes lay depths that made Brenor look away. "Meddle? An interesting choice of words from one who pursues a woman against her will through the wild lands. Tell me, son of Baver, by what right do you claim dominion over the daughter of Baranor?" "By right of law and custom," Brenor replied, but his earlier confidence had faded. "The bride price was paid, the contracts signed. She belongs to me." "Belongs?" Glorfindel's voice carried a note of dangerous music now, like the sound of wind before a storm. "You speak as if she were a horse to be purchased, a piece of goods to be owned. Such thinking was old when the world was young, and no more worthy now than it was then." Aldenor watched the exchange with growing amazement. It was clear that the elf lord's arrival was no coincidence. Somehow word of Miriel's flight had reached Rivendell, though by what means he could not guess. More puzzling still was the authority with which Glorfindel spoke, as if he had some standing in the matter beyond mere chance encounter. "My lord speaks truly," Miriel said, stepping forward with her chin raised in defiance. "I am no man's chattel, no matter what gold has changed hands or what papers have been signed in my absence. I go where I will, with whom I choose, and none shall gainsay me in this." Brenor's face twisted with rage at her words, but he was too wise to let emotion override calculation. 20 men might overwhelm a single ranger, but against even a handful of elves, the outcome was far from certain. And there were stories, dark tales of those who had crossed the servants of the hidden realm and lived to regret their presumption. "The law stands whether elf lords approve or not," he said finally. Her father agreed to the match. "The bride price is paid. If she will not come willingly, then force must serve where persuasion fails." "Force?" Glorfindel smiled, and the expression was beautiful and terrible to behold. "You speak of force to one who walked the halls of Gondolin when your ancestors were yet learning to forge iron? Who stood upon the walls of Gil-galad when the last alliance marched to war? Choose your words more carefully, mortal, lest you find them turned back upon you like arrows from a shield." The warriors behind Glorfindel had spread out now, not in the crude encirclement that Brenor's men had attempted, but in a formation that spoke of discipline beyond mortal measure. Their hands rested lightly upon their sword hilts, but the threat they represented was clear to all who had eyes to see. Yet even as the tension mounted toward open conflict, another voice spoke from the darkness beyond the ruin, a voice that made both elf and mortal turn in surprise. "Enough!" Oti, from the shadow, stepped a figure that Aldenor recognized with shock. Baranor himself, chieftain of the northern settlements, and Miriel's father. But the man who emerged into the starlight was not the proud leader Aldenor remembered. 20 years had bent his shoulders and silvered his hair, and in his eyes lay a weariness that spoke of burdens too long carried. "Father?" Miriel's voice was barely a whisper. Behind Baranor came more riders, his personal guard, men Aldenor knew from the days when he had served in the chieftain's hall. Their faces were grim, but not with the cruel satisfaction of Brenor's sellsword. These were men caught between duty and conscience, following orders they clearly found distasteful. "My daughter," Baranor said heavily, "you have led us a chase across half the wild land, but it ends here, as all flights must end when the hunter is determined and the quarry grows weary." Miriel straightened, and in her bearing, Aldenor saw the same pride that had marked her father in his younger days. "It ends here, yes," she said clearly, "but not as you think. I will not be sold like livestock to fill your coffers, father. I am your daughter, not your goods." Pain flickered across Baranor's weathered features. "You think me a monster," he said softly. "You think I do this from greed or cruelty, but you do not know, cannot know, what pressures weigh upon a leader in these dark times." "Then tell me," she challenged. "Explain to me why my happiness and freedom must be sacrificed on the altar of your politics." The old chieftain looked around the circle of faces, his daughter defiant, Brenor smug with anticipated triumph, the elves watchful and dangerous, Aldenor standing protective at Miriel's side. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of terrible revelation. "Because if you do not marry him," he said quietly, "Brenor will destroy us all." Silence fell upon the ruins like a shroud, broken only by the distant call of a night bird and the restless stamping of horses. Baranor's words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that none had fully grasped until this moment. "Explain yourself," Glorfindel said, his voice carrying the authority of ages. Though he spoke softly, there was something in his tone that compelled truth from even the most reluctant lips. Baranor's shoulders sagged, as if he bore the weight of mountains. "You know our lands, Lord Glorfindel, harsh country, where the soil yields little, and winter comes early. For generations we have survived by trade, furs and metals from the northern reaches, exchanged for grain and gold from the southern market. But the trade routes have grown perilous, and merchants fear to travel where orcs and wolves roam freely. And so?" Miriel asked, though Aldenor could see she was beginning to understand. "And so we must seek other means to fill our coffers," her father continued. "Brenor controls the eastern roads now. His caravans move under heavy guard. His warehouses supply half the settlements between here and the Misty Mountains. He has offered to extend his protection to our traders, to guarantee their safe passage and profitable sale." Brenor smiled like a cat before a bowl of cream. "At a fair price, naturally. Nothing in this world comes without cost." "What price?" Aldenor asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Marriage to my daughter," Baranor said heavily. "A binding of our houses that would make his interests our interests, his wealth our security. Refuse, and his protection is withdrawn. Our traders venture forth unguarded. Our people face the prospect of want and starvation when the harsh months come." "So you would purchase security with your daughter's freedom," Glorfindel observed. There was no condemnation in his voice, but neither was there approval. "An old bargain, and one that rarely ends well for those who make." "Easy words for one who has not watched children go hungry," Brenner interjected. "Easy judgments from those who dwell in hidden valleys, where want and worry are but distant memories. The world is harsher than your songs would have it, elf lord." Miriel stepped forward, her eyes blazing with righteous anger. "And so I am to be the price of that bargain? My life, my choices, my happiness, all sacrificed so that others may live in comfort? Would you see your people starve?" her father asked quietly. "Would you have the children of our settlements face winter without adequate stores, simply to preserve your own freedom?" It was a cruel question, Aldenor realized, the kind of impossible choice that left stains upon the soul no matter what answer was given. He had seen such dilemmas before in his years of wandering, had watched good men and women forced into decisions that hollowed out their hearts, even as they served the greater good. But it was not the only answer, if one had courage to seek alternative. "There is another way," he said quietly. All eyes turned to him, and Aldenor felt the familiar weight of attention that came when desperate people looked for salvation to one who might disappoint them. But this time, the paralysis did not come. Perhaps it was the presence of the elves, or Miriel's faith in him, or simply the fact that darkness had already tested him this night and found him standing. "Speak, then," Glorfindel said, and there was something in the elf lord's voice that suggested he had been waiting for these very words. "The eastern roads are perilous because they lack proper protection," Aldenor said, his mind racing as the plan took shape. "Brenor's guards serve only his caravan, leaving others to face the wolves, and worse alone. But what if there were rangers to ride those paths? What if the king's men returned to guard the king's road?" Brenor's laugh was harsh as iron on stone. "Pretty thoughts, but the Dunedain are few and scattered. A handful of wanderers cannot guard roads that stretch from here to the Misty Mountain." "Perhaps not," Aldenor conceded, "but we need not guard all the roads, only secure them long enough for proper garrisons to be established. There are men in Bree, in Arche, in a dozen settlements who would take service if they knew the way was being prepared. Give them hope of success rather than certainty of death, and they will come." "And who would lead this great endeavor?" Baranor asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to see where the conversation led. "I would," Aldenor said simply. "I know these lands, know the settlements and the people. More, I know the hiding places of the orc bands and the wolf packs. Clear them out systematically, establish way stations for travelers, coordinate with the local militia. It can be done." "By one man?" Brenorr scoffed. "Not by one man," Glorfindel interjected, and now his voice carried a note of satisfaction. "By one man, with the backing of Rivendell, and the knowledge that in Imladris there are those who remember when the roads were safe and traders moved without fear." Understanding dawned on several faces at once. This was no chance meeting. The elf lord had come here with purpose, knowing what would unfold among the ruins of Weathertop. But whether he had foreseen all of it, or merely hoped for the best, none could say. "You would support such an undertaking?" Baranor asked wonderingly. "The safety of the roads serves all who travel them," Glorfindel replied carefully, "and there are considerations that make the establishment of proper order in these lands a matter of some importance to my master." He did not elaborate, but Aldenor caught the meaningful look that passed between the elf lord and Miriel. There were currents here he did not fully understand, but one thing was clear. This had been planned, perhaps for longer than any of them realized. "A fine scheme," Brenorr said, his voice dripping with contempt. "But it would take months to implement, perhaps years. My offer stands now, today. Choose quickly, Baranor, for my patience grows thin." "And if the roads were secured?" Miriel asked suddenly. "If trade could flow freely without need of your protection, would you release your claim upon me?" The merchant's smile was cold as winter steel. "If such a miracle came to pass, I would have no need of alliance with your father's house. But such things exist only in the realm of possibility, not certainty. I deal in the world as it is, not as dreamers wish it might be." "Then we have our term," Aldenor said. "Give me 1 year to secure the eastern road. If I succeed, the lady's freedom is assured. If I fail—" He spread his hands, leaving the consequences unspoken. "And what surety do you offer?" Brenner demanded. "What guarantee that you will not simply ride away into the wild, leaving us to debate empty promises?" It was then that Miriel spoke words that surprised them all. "I will go with him." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled company. Even Glorfindel, who had seemed to anticipate much of what had transpired, raised an eyebrow at this unexpected development. "Daughter? No," Baranor said immediately. "The roads are far too dangerous. For a helpless maiden, perhaps." Miriel interrupted, her chin raised in defiance. "But I am not helpless, father. You seem to forget that I learned swordplay alongside the boys, that I can track game through the forest, and find my way by star and sun. I will not be a burden to slow the ranger's work." "It is madness," Brenner snarled, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "A woman has no place in such an enterprise. Send her back to her father's hall where she belongs." The dismissal in his tone was the final spark needed to ignite Muriel's anger fully. "Where I belong where I choose to be, not where men decide to place me like a piece upon a game board. If Aldenor will have me as companion, then companion I shall be." Aldenor found himself caught between admiration for her courage and concern for her safety. The roads were indeed perilous, filled with dangers that would test even an experienced warrior. Yet there was something in her bearing that reminded him powerfully of the child who had faced flame and smoke without flinching, who had trusted him to lead her to safety when others had given up hope. "The choice is yours to make," he said carefully, "but understand what you ask. We would ride into lands where death waits around every bend, where comfort is a rare luxury and danger a constant companion. Are you certain this is the path you would choose?" "More certain than I have ever been of anything," she replied without hesitation. Glorfindel stepped forward, his ageless features thoughtful. "There is wisdom in her words," he said slowly. "Two riders can cover more ground than one. Watch each other's backs when enemies approach. And there are places where a woman might go that would be closed to a man traveling alone. Settlements where suspicion runs deep and strangers are viewed with mistrust." "You would encourage this folly?" Baranor demanded. "I would encourage courage wherever I find it," the elf lord replied. "Your daughter shows the same spirit that led her ancestors to take up sword and shield in defense of their people. Who are we to say such spirit should be caged?" Brenor's face had grown dark with rage, but he was too wise to give voice to his fury before so many witnesses. Instead, he spoke with the cold calculation of a merchant closing a difficult bargain. "Very well," he said through gritted teeth. "Let her ride with this fool ranger into whatever doom awaits them. But mark my words well. When the year turns and the roads remain unsafe, when this grand scheme crumbles to dust, as all such dreams must, I will come to collect what is owed me, and then there will be no more talk of choice or freedom." "And if they succeed?" Glorfindel asked mildly. "If they succeed, truly succeed, not merely claim success while leaving the work half done, then I will withdraw my claim and seek alliance elsewhere." Brenor's smile held no warmth. "But they will not succeed. The wilds are too vast, the dangers too many, the task too great for any two people to accomplish." "Then you have nothing to lose by agreeing to the terms," Muriel observed. "Unless, of course, you doubt your own assessment of the situation." It was a neat trap, and Brenor knew it. To refuse now would be to admit uncertainty about his position, to show weakness before his own men and potential rivals. But to agree was to risk losing the prize he had already paid so dearly to obtain. In the end, greed won out over caution, as it so often did. "1 year," he said harshly, "from this night until the next summer's end. The eastern roads from Bree to the Misty Mountain, safe for any honest merchant to travel. Fail in any part of them, the lady becomes my bride, whether she wills it or not." "Witnessed and agreed," Glorfindel said formally, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to sealing great bargains. "By starlight and moonbeam, by earth and sky, let all here present bear witness to this pact." The ancient words seemed to echo strangely among the ruins, as if the very stones of Amonsul remembered other oaths sworn in darker days. Aldenor felt the weight of the commitment settle upon his shoulders like a cloak of lead, but also the fierce joy that came with having a clear purpose at last. "Where will you begin?" Baranor asked, and there was something in his voice that might have been pride. "At the beginning," Aldenor replied. "We will ride first to Bree, to take counsel with the mayor and the watch captain. Then south to Archay and east to Combe, gathering what information we can about the worst of the dangers. Only when we know our enemy can we plan our campaign. And I will return to Rivendell." Glorfindel added, "to bring word of this night's work to my master. There are resources that may be made available to aid your quest, provisions and guidance that could mean the difference between success and failure." "How long before we see aid from that quarter?" Miriel asked. The elf lord smiled, and for a moment his ageless features seemed almost young. "Sooner than you might expect. The roads between here and Imladris have been prepared for swift travel when need arises." Again, Aldenor caught the hint of deeper currents, plans within plans that reached back further than this night's events. But there would be time to puzzle over such things later. For now, there was work to be done, and little time to waste. "Then we ride at dawn," he said. "The sooner begun, the sooner finished." But even as he spoke the words, a part of his mind wondered if any of them truly understood what they had set in motion, or what the true cost of success might prove to be. 3 days had passed since the pact was made beneath the stars at Weathertop, and already the first fruits of their labor were becoming apparent. Aldenor and Miriel had ridden hard for Bree, reaching the town as the second day's sun climbed toward its zenith. There they had found willing ears among the Bree folk, though mixed with the skepticism that came naturally to those who had learned to expect little help from the outside world. Mayor Whitfoot had proved surprisingly knowledgeable about the problems that plagued the eastern roads, having lost more than one trading partner to orc raids and wolf packs. Captain Brackenberry of the Watch was equally forthcoming, his records showing a pattern of attacks that spoke of coordination beyond mere chance. "It's not random brigandage," the grizzled captain had explained, spreading a hand-drawn map across his desk. "Look here, 3 attacks along the Greenway in as many weeks, all striking caravans bound for the same destination. And here, on the East Road, 2 separate bands hitting within a day's march of each other. Someone's been watching, learning the patterns of honest trade." Now, as they sat in the common room of the Prancing Pony, Aldenor studied the information they had gathered with growing unease. The attacks were indeed too organized, too well-timed to be the work of scattered orc bands acting independently. Someone was coordinating them, someone with intelligence enough to understand the rhythms of commerce and the weaknesses of the current guard arrangements. "A gold piece for your thoughts," Miriel said, settling into the chair across from him with 2 tankards of ale. "Dark thoughts, I fear," Aldanor replied, accepting the drink gratefully. "The pattern troubles me. We face not mere beasts seeking easy prey, but something that thinks and plans like a man or woman." Miriel observed with a slight smile. "Do not let your assumptions about leadership blind you to possibility." He acknowledged the point with a nod. "True enough, but whoever leads this conspiracy, they have knowledge that should not be available to them. They know when caravans depart, what routes they plan to take, how many guards travel with them. Such information could only come from a source within the settlements themselves," Miriel finished. "Someone with access to the merchants' plans and the resources to communicate with the raiders." "Exactly. Which means our task may be more complex than simply clearing wolves and orcs from the roadways. We may need to root out treachery from within the very community we seek to protect." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. The door of the common room opened to admit a figure that drew immediate attention, tall and lordly, with the kind of bearing that spoke of noble birth and high education. His cloak was travel-stained but fine, his boots well-made, though worn with long walking. But it was his eyes that held Aldenor's attention, dark and piercing, with an intensity that seemed to look through surface appearances to the truth beneath. The stranger approached their table with confident strides, pausing just close enough to speak, without being overheard by the room's other occupants. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, his voice cultured and pleasant. "But I believe we may have mutual interests to discuss. I am Sareth, lately of Tharbad, and I have been following the news of your enterprise with considerable interest." Aldenor's hand moved instinctively toward his sword hilt, but something in the stranger's manner suggested more curiosity than threat. "News travels swiftly," It seems we have barely begun our work, yet already word has spread. In these times, any hope of improved safety draws attention. Sareth replied smoothly, "May I?" He gestured toward an empty chair at their table. Muriel studied the stranger with sharp eyes. "That depends on what you wish to discuss, and why a man of Tharbad should interest himself in the troubles of Bree-land." "Because the troubles are not limited to Bree-land," Sareth said, as he settled into the offered seat. "The same organized raids, the same uncanny knowledge of merchant movement can be found from here to the borders of Rohan. Someone has built a network of remarkable scope and efficiency." This was news indeed, and Aldenor leaned forward with sharp interest. "You have proof of it." "I have eyes and ears, and the freedom to travel where others cannot," Sareth replied. "For the past year, I have been investigating these attacks, following threads of connection from one raided caravan to another. The pattern becomes clear once you know what to look for." "And what pattern is that?" Muriel asked. Sareth glanced around the common room, assuring himself that no other ears were close enough to overhear. Then he leaned forward and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "The raiders are being coordinated through the use of a palantir." The words hit Aldenor like a physical blow. A seeing stone, one of the ancient artifacts of Numenor, capable of communicating across vast distances to those who knew their use. Such things were treasures beyond price, tools of immense power that had once linked the great cities of Gondor and Arnor in a network of knowledge and command. "Impossible," he breathed. "The Palantiri are lost, or held in places beyond the reach of common criminals." "Are they?" Sareth's smile was enigmatic. 7 stones were brought from Numenor when the kingdom fell. 4 were lost or destroyed in the wars that followed. Of the remaining 3, 1 sits in Minas Tirith under the guard of the steward. 1 was lost with Isildur in the Gladden field, and 1 was at Fornost, Muriel finished, her face pale with understanding, in the tower of the king, until the realm fell and the city was abandoned. "And what happens to priceless artifacts when cities fall?" Sareth asked rhetorically. "They are plundered by those who recognize their value, or hidden by those who hope for a future restoration. Either way, they do not simply vanish from the world." Aldenor felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with horrible clarity. A palantir in the wrong hands could indeed coordinate the kind of network they had discovered, allowing instant communication across hundreds of miles, enabling a central intelligence to direct attacks with precision impossible through normal means. "If this is true," he said slowly, "then we face an enemy far more dangerous than we imagined. Whoever controls such a stone would have power beyond the reach of ordinary methods to counter." "Not beyond all methods," Sareth said quietly. "There are ways to locate a palantir, to track its use, and perhaps even to interfere with its function. But such methods require knowledge that few in Middle-earth still possess." "And you possess such knowledge?" Muriel asked, her tone carefully neutral. The stranger's smile widened slightly. "I possess some knowledge, yes, enough, perhaps, to be of service to your cause. The question is whether you are willing to accept help from one whose methods may not always accord with conventional wisdom." It was a dangerous offer, Aldenor knew, to ally with a stranger whose true motives remained hidden, who claimed knowledge of arts that few understood, was to walk a path fraught with peril. Yet if Sareth spoke truly, if they did indeed face an enemy wielding one of the ancient seeing stones, then conventional methods would serve them ill. "What price would you ask for such aid?" he asked finally. "No price in gold or goods," Sareth replied, "but when the stone is found, I would ask for the right to study it before it is destroyed or hidden away. There are questions about its nature and history that only direct examination could answer." "Dangerous questions," Muriel observed. "All the most important questions are dangerous," Sareth agreed. "But ignorance is often more perilous than knowledge, however dark that knowledge might be." Aldenor looked at Muriel, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in her gray eyes. They had set out to clear the roads of brigands and wolves, not to pursue ancient artifacts and confront powers from the elder days. Yet, if they turned away from this path, How many more would die while the true enemy remained hidden in shadow? "We will consider your offer," he said at last. "But first, tell us more of what you know. If we are to walk into darkness, we would do so with our eyes open." Sareth nodded, his expression growing grave. "Then listen well, for the tale I have to tell will change everything you thought you knew about the troubles that plague these lands." The story that Sareth told them stretched long into the night, and with each detail the scope of their task seemed to grow ever more daunting. According to the mysterious stranger, the network of raiders was but the visible edge of a conspiracy that reached back years its planning and encompassed territories from Tharbad to the Lonely Mountain. "It began with small things," he explained, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the common room's fire. "A caravan here, a trading post there, losses that could be attributed to the ordinary hazards of travel in dangerous times. But gradually, the pattern emerged. Attacks too well coordinated to be random, information too precise to be accidental." "And you believe this all stems from a single source?" Miriel asked. "Not a single person, but a single instrument of control," Sareth corrected. "The Palantir allows whoever wields it to coordinate activities across vast distances, to gather intelligence from multiple sources, and direct responses with the speed of thought. It is the perfect tool for the kind of network we face." Aldenor leaned back in his chair, his mind racing through the implications. If such a stone exists and is being used for these purposes, where would it be hidden? The wielder would need a secure location, somewhere defensible, but with access to information about merchant movement. "That is indeed the question," Sareth agreed, "and I believe I may have found the answer. Have either of you heard tell of Dol Guldur?" The name sent a chill through the room that had nothing to do with the night air seeping through the window. Dol Guldur, the Hill of Sorcery, the fortress in Mirkwood, where the necromancer had once held sway before his true identity was revealed, and he was driven forth by the White Council. "You speak of the stronghold of the necromancer," Miriel said, her voice tight with tension. "But that place was cleansed, its evil driven out when Sauron was forced to flee to Mordor." "Was it?" Sareth's smile held no humor. "The Dark Lord fled, yes. But did all his servants follow? Did all his works crumble when his presence was withdrawn? Or might some remnant have remained, biding its time and slowly rebuilding what was lost?" The possibility was chilling, but Aldenor could see the logic. Dol Guldur commanded the southern edge of Mirkwood, with clear sight lines to the roads that crossed the Anduin and access to the riverlands where much of the North's trade flowed. A Palantir positioned there could indeed coordinate the kind of network discovered. "Even if you are correct," he said slowly, "Dol Guldur lies hundreds of miles from here, deep in lands where few dare to travel. How could we hope to reach it, let alone assault whatever defenses remain?" "One step at a time," Sareth replied. "First, we must confirm that the conspiracy indeed reaches beyond these local troubles. I propose we follow the thread eastward, toward the source of the coordination. If I am right, the trail will lead us to agents operating ever closer to Mirkwood's borders. And if you are wrong, then we will have cleared the roads of their immediate threats and left the greater mystery for others to solve," Sareth said with a shrug. "But I do not think I am wrong. The pattern is too clear, the coordination too precise for any lesser explanation." Miriel had been silent during this exchange, her gray eyes distant with thought. Now she spoke, and her words carried a weight that surprised both men. "There is something you should know," she said quietly, "something that bears upon this matter, though I had not thought it relevant until now." Both Aldenor and Sareth turned to her with sharp attention. "Before I fled from Fornost," she continued, "I overheard a conversation between my father and one of his advisors. They spoke of strange dreams that had been troubling the chieftain's sleep, visions of a great eye watching from the south, of shadows moving where no shadows should be. At the time I thought it merely the product of an old man's fears, but now you wonder if it might have been something more," Sareth finished. "A vision sent through the Palantir network, perhaps intended to influence or intimidate those in positions of power. Is such a thing possible? Aldenor asked. With one of the seeing stones? Certainly. They were designed not merely for communication, but for gathering intelligence across vast distances. In the hands of one skilled in their use, they could reach into the dreams and thoughts of those who possessed the strength of will to resist direct domination. The implications were staggering. If Sareth spoke truly, then the conspiracy they faced was not merely one of brigandage and theft, but of psychological warfare directed against the leaders of the free people. Baranor's increasing isolation, his willingness to sell his daughter's freedom for the promise of security, might these not be the natural products of a mind under subtle assault? How do we proceed? Miriel asked. If we face an enemy capable of reaching into men's dreams, how can we hope to stand against such power? By remembering that even the mightiest weapons have their limitations, Sareth replied. The Palantiri are bound by certain laws and restrictions. They cannot compel obedience from those who know they are being watched, cannot penetrate minds that are properly warded, cannot function effectively if their wielder is distracted or threatened. You speak as one who has studied these matters deeply, Aldenor observed. What is your true interest in these stones? For the first time since their conversation began, Sareth hesitated. When he spoke again, there was something in his voice that had not been there before, a note of old pain carefully controlled. Let us say that I have reasons to be concerned about the misuse of such artifacts, he said finally, reasons that touch upon my own history and the debts I owe to those no longer living to collect them. It was not a complete answer, but it was all they were likely to get for the moment. Aldenor found himself in the familiar position of having to make decisions based on incomplete information, a skill that years of ranging had taught him to cultivate. Very well, he said at last, we will accept your alliance, at least for now. But understand this, if your true purposes prove to conflict with the safety of innocent folk, our partnership ends. Understood and agreed, Sareth replied formally. Now, shall we discuss our next move? I believe our path lies toward Arche, where certain rumors have reached my ears that may prove illuminating. As they bent over the rough map spread between them, planning routes and considering dangers, none of them noticed the figure that slipped away from the window where it had been listening. By the time they thought to check their surroundings, the spy was long gone, carrying word of their plans to masters who served darker purposes than any of them yet imagined. The game was afoot, and the stakes were higher than they knew. The path to Archet wound through country that grew wilder with each mile, the tamed fields and hedgerows of Bree-land giving way to rougher terrain where oak and ash crowded close to the roadway. It was good country for ambush, Aldenor noted, though their small party was likely too poor a target to attract serious attention from brigands. 3 riders with travel-worn gear and no obvious wealth would hardly merit the risk of attacking travelers who might well prove more dangerous than profitable. They had been riding since dawn, making good time despite the increasingly difficult terrain. Sareth had proved an able companion, his knowledge of the roads and their dangers matching even Aldenor's hard-won experience. He rode like one born to the saddle, his strange dark eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for signs of threat or interest. Tell me, Miriel said during a brief halt to rest their horses, how came you to know so much of Palantiri and their uses? Such knowledge is not commonly found among the scholars of Tharbad. Sareth was quiet for so long that Aldenor began to think he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if dragged from some deep well of memory. My father was a lore master, he said at last, one of the few who still studied the artifacts and histories of Numenor. He believed that knowledge should not be hidden away in dusty libraries, but put to use in service of the living. That belief cost him his life. How so? Aldenor asked gently. He discovered evidence that one of the lost Palantiri had survived the fall of Fornost. Sareth continued. More than that, he learned that it had fallen into the hands of those who served the enemy. When he tried to bring word to the authorities, he was branded a madman and driven from his position. When he persisted, he met with an accident on a dark road one winter's night. Understanding dawned in Aldenor's mind. You believe he was murdered to silence him. I know he was murdered, Sareth said flatly. I was there. I saw the men who did it, heard the orders they carried from their master. My father died because he learned too much about the wrong people, and I have spent the last 15 years gathering the proof he died trying to deliver. The revelation cast their mission in an entirely new light. This was not merely a chance encounter with a helpful stranger, but the culmination of a quest that had consumed the better part of a man's life. Yet before Aldenor could formulate a response, a new sound reached their ears, the thunder of hoofbeats approaching at speed from the direction of Arche. A single rider came into view around the bend ahead, his horse lathered with sweat and his face marked by the desperate urgency of one bearing ill tidings. He pulled up short at the sight of their party, his hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt before recognition dawned in his eyes. "Master Aldenor!" he gasped. "Thank the valor I found you. You must come quickly. Archet is under attack." The messenger was young Tom Whitfurrow, son of a farmer Aldenor had known in years past. The boy's face was streaked with smoke and tears, his clothes torn and bloodied from hard riding. "What manner of attack?" Aldenor demanded, already swinging back into his saddle. "Orcs and wolves, but led by men," Tom replied, his voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. "They came in the deep of night, setting fires and driving folk from their homes. But it's worse than that. They're taking prisoners, rounding up anyone with knowledge of the trade routes or merchant schedule." "How many?" Miriel asked as she urged her horse into motion. 20 or more, moving with the kind of discipline you'd expect from soldiers rather than brigands. And their leader, Tom shuddered visibly. Their leader is no common man, tall as a tree, pale as death, with eyes that burn like coals in shadow. The folks say he's some kind of sorcerer. Sareth exchanged a significant look with his companion. "It seems our enemies have decided to move against us before we can complete our investigation," he observed grimly. "Or to eliminate witnesses who might have inconvenient knowledge," Aldenor added. The attack on Arche was no coincidence. Someone had learned of their plans and moved to forestall them. They rode hard for the remaining miles, pushing their horses to the limit of endurance. The smell of smoke reached them long before the town came into view. And when they finally crested the last hill overlooking the settlement, the scene that greeted them was one of controlled devastation. Archet burned, but not with the random destruction of a typical raid. Certain buildings had been spared. The inn, the trading post, the homes of those who might possess valuable information. Others had been systematically destroyed, their inhabitants driven out, or worse. It was the work of an intelligence that understood the value of different targets, that knew precisely what it sought to accomplish. At the center of the destruction stood a figure that matched young Tom's description, tall and pale, wrapped in robe that seemed to drink in light rather than reflect it. Even at this distance, Aldenor could sense the aura of power that surrounded the being, a cold malevolence that spoke of arts better left buried. "I know him," Sareth said quietly, his voice tight with old anger. "Khamul the Easterling, second only to the Witch King among the 9, but that is impossible. The Nazgul were destroyed when the ring was unmade." "Were they?" a new voice asked from behind them. They turned to find a fourth rider had joined their group, an old man wrapped in gray robes, his face weathered by age and wisdom, but his eyes were bright with power, and in his hand he carried a staff that seemed to gleam with inner light. "Mithrandir?" Miriel gasped. Gandalf the Grey nodded gravely. "Indeed, I felt the stirring of dark power and came as swiftly as I might. But I fear we may be too late to prevent the revelation of the true scope of this conspiracy." "What do you mean?" Aldenor asked. "Look again at the figure below," the wizard commanded. "Look with eyes that see beyond the surface of things." Aldenor focused his attention on the pale leader, and gradually his perception shifted. The robes of shadow fell away like a discarded disguise, revealing beneath them a form that was familiar yet impossible. It was Brenor. But Brenor transformed, his features refined and sharpened, his presence magnified beyond mortal measure. The merchant's calculating greed had been replaced by something far more terrible, the cold malice of one who had traded his humanity for power beyond reckoning. "He is not Nazgul," Gandalf said quietly, but something perhaps worse. A mortal man who has voluntarily accepted dominion by the shadow. The Palantir you seek is indeed being used, but not by some distant enemy in Dol Guldur. It is here, in the hands of one who has been building his network of control for years, using the promise of marriage and alliance to mask his true purposes. The pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place with devastating clarity. Brenor's wealth, his knowledge of trade routes, his ability to coordinate attacks across vast distances, all of it made sense if he possessed one of the Seeing Stones. More than that, his pursuit of Miriel was not mere avarice, but part of a larger plan to extend his influence into the northern settlements. He seeks to create a realm of shadow in the north, Sareth said, understanding dawning in his voice, using trade and commerce as weapons of conquest, binding the settlements to his will through economic dependency and fear. And he would have succeeded, Gandalf added grimly, had you not chosen to stand against him. But now, the mask is off, and the true battle begins. Below them, the figure that had been Brenor turned toward their hilltop vantage point, as if sensing their presence despite the distance. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the space between them, magnified by arts that had nothing to do with nature. "Welcome, Aldenor of the Dunedain," the transformed merchant called, his words dripping with mockery. "You arrived just in time to witness the final act of a drama that has been 20 years in the making. Did you truly think your little bargain could stand against powers that have been preparing since before you drew breath?" Gandalf raised his staff, its light growing brighter in response to the malevolence below. "Show yourself truly, servant of shadow. Let us see what price you have paid for your borrowed power." Brenor's laughter echoed across the burning town like the sound of breaking glass. "Price? You speak of price to one who has gained dominion over half the trade routes of Middle-earth? Who has built an empire of fear and dependency that spans from the Shire to the Lonely Mountain? The only price I paid was my illusion of mortal limitation." The truth of it hit Aldenor like a physical blow. The network they had discovered was not some recent conspiracy, but the culmination of a plan decades in the making. Brenor had been building his web of control since before the War of the Ring, using the chaos and disruption of those times to position himself as a necessary ally to settlements desperate for stability. "The Palantir," Sareth breathed. "How long has he possessed it?" "Since the fall of Fornos," Gandalf replied grimly. "It was thought lost when the city was abandoned, but in truth it was taken by one who had already begun his journey into shadow. Brenor was but a young merchant then, ambitious and unscrupulous. The stone fed his ambition while slowly consuming his soul. Below them, the transformed figure raised something in his hands, a sphere of black crystal that seemed to drink in the very light around it. The corrupted Palantir pulsed with malevolent energy, and through it, Aldenor could sense vast distances being bridged, commands being sent to servants across the length and breadth of Middle-earth. "Behold the instrument of your defeat," Brenor cried. "Through this stone, I command the loyalty of 100 settlements, coordinate the movements of 1,000 raiders, bend the will of chieftains and mayors, from here to the Grey Haven. What can 4 travelers hope to accomplish against such power?" "More than you might imagine," Miriel said quietly, and there was something in her voice that made all present turn to look at her. She had dismounted from her horse and now stood at the edge of the hilltop, her hands raised toward the burning town below. In her palms lay a small object that caught the starlight and threw it back in myriad colors. Another Palantir, smaller than Brenor's, but blazing with clean, white light. "Impossible," Sareth gasped. How did you—" "I took it from my father's chambers the night I fled Fornos," Miriel said simply. "It was hidden in a secret compartment behind his desk, wrapped in silk and elvish silver. I knew not what it was, only that it seemed important enough to conceal." Understanding flooded through Aldenor with the force of revelation. The dreams that had plagued Baranor, the subtle influences that had driven him toward increasingly desperate decisions, they had not been the product of distant communication through Brenor's corrupted stone. but the result of proximity to a second Palantir that had been calling to its companion for decades. This is why Glorfindel came, he realized aloud. This is why Rivendell took interest in our quest. The elves sensed the presence of both stones and knew that their conflict would soon come to a head. The Elf Lord has been most attentive to certain developments in the north, Gandalf confirmed, but even his foresight could not predict exactly how events would unfold. The choice to reveal the stone was yours alone to make, Lady Muriel. Below them, Brenor's triumphant expression had shifted to one of fury and disbelief. "You dare!" he snarled, raising his own stone higher. "You think that trinket can match the power I have gathered? I, who have spent decades learning the secrets of the Palantiri, who have bent their function to my will." The two stones began to resonate with each other, sending waves of power washing across the landscape. Where Brenor's artifact pulsed with malevolent shadow, Muriel's blazed with the clean light of stars. The very air between them seemed to crackle with opposing forces. "Now we shall see," Gandalf said, his voice carrying the weight of command, which proves stronger, power seized in darkness, or authority freely given in light. The final confrontation had begun, and with it would come the resolution of a conflict that had shaped the fate of the northern land for a generation. But as the opposing forces gathered their strength, Aldenor found himself wondering if any of them would survive to see the outcome. In the distance, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and in their depths, lightning flickered like the weapons of angry gods. The ranger who feared the dark would face his greatest test, not in shadow, but in the terrible radiance of powers beyond mortal comprehension, clashing in the night sky above. The story that had begun with a simple quest to clear the road would end with a battle that would be remembered in song for generations to come, if there were any left alive to sing of it.